Now this is the last part in a three-part series I've been doing on this book, The War Magician, written by David Fisher. And excuse me. And for my previous videos that I have done on this, part 1 and part 2, I'll have a link in the description. There's also going to be a link as well for a History Channel presentation called The War Illusionist, where they talk about Jasper Maskelyne. Now, the information I give out of the book is a lot more detail than what you'll see in the video presentation done by the History Channel. Now, where we stopped at the point where Jasper Maskelyne caused Alexandria Harbor to actually switch places with another harbor called Marylet, if I pronounce that right. Where is it at? I don't remember where I wrote that at, but Mariette Bay. So they fooled the Germans into bombing the wrong harbor, a harbor there's nothing there. There's nothing strategic there at all. So they wasted all their time. And if you watch my other videos, you'll know more about how the War Magician got to where he was. Jasper Maskelyne, again, he didn't want to just do magic tricks or magic shows for the troops. He wanted to have an active part in the war effort to actually help win the war against Germany. And he had an uphill battle trying to convince the army, the British army, of his value as a magician. And one of the first things he did when he finally became an officer in the British Army had to do a showdown between another magician, an imam of the Dervish tribe in North Africa. But this person didn't use his magic either to entertain nor to battle against an enemy. His magic was used to make people think that he had actual special powers and was worthy of his rule as a leader over these people. And the next thing that came after that is he ended up forming what's known as the Magic Gang. He interviewed a handful of men that he felt suitable for creating illusions to fool Rommel and his I can't remember what they called it, but it was to fool Rommel and his troops. But after the showdown with this imam, the next thing they had to do was to try to produce paint, because the army had tanks that were painted green camouflage, but they're in the desert, so that would stand out like a sore thumb. So they had to create paints, and one of the key ingredients to the paint was camel dung. And then after that, the next thing they wanted him to do was to turn a tank into a truck, so that since there's really no way to hide a tank in the desert, they had to make it look like something that it wasn't. So make a tank look like a truck. So it was the next task of the Magic Gang, and that was all prior to the more elaborate and impossible illusion of protecting Alexandria Harbor, making it transfer from one location to another and causing the German bombers to bomb the dummy location, which in fact they did. And they gave up bombing it after a period of time, and they actually saved Alexandria Harbor. So from there, I'm going to go to chapter 6 in his book. I'm going to read here. It says, now that Maskelyne's camouflage section had proven its capabilities under fire, they were deluged by requests for assistance. Every branch seemed to have an oddball problem that required Maskelyne's attention. Most of those requests were temporarily put aside, however, while the Magic Gang supervised construction of a giant magic factory. Magic Valley was actually Magic Barca's idea. The Alexandria scam had made it obvious to him that Maskelyne's operation would have to be expanded. So soon after the gang had returned to Abessia, he took Jasper to a bluff overlooking a long, narrow valley ringed with a garland of thick foliage and announced, "It's all yours." So, interesting, when they built this, it's actually a top secret facility they're building. They don't want anybody to know what's going on there. So, of course, Jasper, he was stunned by this whole idea. Finally, a real piece of work, a giant workshop. As he gazed into the valley, it began to blossom with possibilities. Factories, warehouses, and living quarters, and a spate of offices sprouted in his mind. Within a few months, the desolate valley would be transformed into a garden of illusion in which would grow all manner of military delights. Because then there's a letter that he wrote to his... What was that? This letter he wrote to his wife, Mary. But he said it would be my magic valley. There's nothing there at all right now, just sand and scrub. But when we've finished, it'll be the greatest magic workshop ever built. They've provided me with a generous budget, although Barcus asks that I use salvaged materials whenever possible. Now, the thing is, when he actually built this, what they call it, Magic Valley, his warehouses of illusions, his magic factory, he had to protect it. Actually, had to protect this workshop. So he put all kinds of interesting devices to deter spies from entering his workshop area. Let's see where we got here. Okay. Warning signs in both English and Arabic were posted at all approaches to the area. 100 yards beyond these signs, rows of bright red flags reinforced their meaning. After the signs of the flags, Magic Valley got deadly. But some of the interesting things he had of traps here. Let's see, what did he put on here? Elaborate security system that was installed. Raised sentry boxes were built. Interviews along the crest of the valley, and the open trench stretches between these posts were guarded by a combination of modern interpersonal weapons and the genies and spirits of ancient fairy tales. Yeah, there's some deadly stuff right there. Small minefield out of the area. Electrified wire ran between these fields. Wired fences. Heavy brush were protected by his magical devices. A trespasser might suddenly find himself caught in a maze of mirrors, or be confronted by a frightful image gushing out of the ground. He might stumble over a tripwire and activate a gramophone that broadcast blood-curdling threats, or doors that opened and closed untouched by human hands. Under different circumstances, Maskelyne would have enjoyed inventing these whimsical security systems, but this was a serious matter. The secrets of the valley had to be protected at all costs. Now, of course, if somehow these illusions did not scare the trespassers away, lethal devices awaited. Pressure-triggered rifles and tripwire swords and camouflage pits were placed throughout the area. A few Egyptian spies were known to have reached these obstacles. None managed to survive them, though. The remains of those who died trying to uncover the secrets of Magic Valley were collected by graves registration and delivered to anyone claiming kinship with the victim. Since a burial payment, the equivalent of 10 shillings, were paid in local piastres, there was never a shortage of available relatives. So it was like somebody claiming to be a relative who maybe wasn't. Who knows? Um, and as collaborating with spies was a crime punishable by death. None of these protested the brutality too strongly. Of course, it's also created a bunch of superstition among the locals. I know, again, the imam played on their superstitious beliefs by doing magic tricks and illusions to make them think he had special powers when he really didn't, allowing him to rule over these people. Among superstitious Egyptians, peasants, the place became known as Valley of Dijon, the genie who shakes the earth, and no one dared approach it without good reason. So, among other things that Jasper did, but building Magic Valley, he did indeed do some magical performances for the troops as well. They actually set up a talent show, or which he was a featured performer. So he resumed work on his variety show. It had originally been slated to open in mid-June, but that date had been canceled because of battle axe. That was the military operation. Now his gray pillars attempted to present an appearance of normalcy, while Auchinleck and Cunningham supplied and trained 8th Army. He was asked to mount his show as soon as possible. So it's going to be a variety act. He's going to do his normal act. Large orange and white cardboard posters pictured Jasper in an oriental garb, which is when he actually dressed like that, kind of like Chung Ling Soo. He was basically just a magician. He wasn't from China at all, but he was a magician that would dress in oriental garb as well. So he intended to do his first act in dapper evening clothes and then make a quick change to the brightly colored flowing Chinese robe. And he talks a little bit about how in his career as a performer, he experimented with various characterizations during his career before settling on the Oriental at home had been a favorite of his patrons, particularly when accompanied by properly mystical Eastern magic, although he never mentioned it to anyone except Mary, his wife. When he donned the makeup and the costume, he enjoyed the childlike thrill of play acting. Under that expressionless mask with the Manchu mustache, he was no longer the very British Jasper Maskelyne. It was a small escape, but he thoroughly enjoyed it. So he had, like, instead of Mary as his assistant, he had the opening night neared Maskelyne and his man, and his woman tooped the illusions and sweated to prepare the Empire Theater stage for magic. Overall, Jasper was pleased with the makeshift show. It could not be nearly as elaborate as some of the command performances he had staged, but under the circumstances it would be quite acceptable. So the one girl, Kathy Lewis, I believe is her name, kind of subbing as his assistant in place of Mary, his wife. Like they used to, a young woman that would even hang out with him many nights after rehearsals. Jasper and Kathy Lewis and backstage manager Frank Knox took late tea together. Of course, Frank Knox works with him in terms of also building illusions to fool the Germans. In this situation, it was natural that the two men would cast themselves into protective roles, and to her delight, so they did. She was only 20 years old and had already been in service 2 years. Her job in Clark's covert operations office permitted her no mistakes. Her eating with Jasper and the gang let her be a vivacious young woman. Kind of picture that. Like a fussy parent, Jasper eventually became concerned. She was spending too much time working and not enough time playing. A pretty young girl like that should be out having fun, he told Knox. With all the men in Cairo, you'd think she'd at least have an occasional date. There's time for that, Frank said. Besides, I think she's carrying a torch. For who? Our boy Hill. Now, he's the painter. If you've seen my other earlier videos, Hill's kind of an artist. His painting, and of course, is very important in terms of creating illusions to fool the enemy. You can paint up a tank, a fake tank, or turn the tank into a truck. So we had the painting on the canvas that's covering the tank. It has to be very realistic looking, so it actually looks like a truck. So having an artist, a painter who knows how to make things look real is quite important. Jasper didn't believe it, the way she talks about him. You silly fool, Franken said, chuckling, and speaking as a father of 2 teenage daughters. Obviously you don't understand girls at all. Now see here, Jasper protested. I've got a 13-year-old myself, you know. Well, unfortunately, Jay, she doesn't seem to have taught you very much. The thing about girls is that you don't listen to what they say. It'll make no sense at all to a rational man. She talks about him, that's what counts. So it's kind of fun. And about here where they talk about some of their personal life that's going on, personal goings in the book. We're going to skip over to, let's see, right here. Let's see. I was talking about the show. Talking for a habit that Jasper has about cleaning the house. At St. George's Hall, each head had made a difference. He learned to know to gag long before he was allowed to perform. To toe to gag long before he was allowed to perform here. It was a useless exercise, but he was cheered by the full house. And of course, he was the opening act. Suddenly the spotlight was on him. Hansel got up in white shirt and noble tails. He kept his head down and his frown in place as he walked slowly to center stage. The spotlight was big and warm and fit him perfectly. For a few seconds he did not hear the welcoming applause. The spotlight was a comfortable cloak isolating him from the rest of the world. He talks more about his reaction here. And of course, Kathy, being new to show business here and helping out, was visibly nervous when she first came on stage to set down a prop table, but he settled her with a private smile, and she grew more confident as the performance continued. So, now he started off small and worked big with his illusions, mastering him using slice, blossomed into small illusions. After turning a red handkerchief white, he changed it into an egg and tossed it into the air above the audience. At his command, he pressed through it, burst into flame, startling everyone, and from the smoke emerged a white dove. The bird gracefully circled the theater and finally swooped down to perch on the magician's outstretched arm. So, I'm talking more about the show. As he worked, Jasper was acutely attuned to everything taking place around him. Now, again, I've done magic shows before. I've never done big stage shows, but even just doing a small show for elderly people at a rest home, you have to keep track of all these different things in terms of all your tricks you're doing, keep in your head what's happening, and make sure everything's set up correctly, make sure everything's in the right place. So keeping tuned everything taking place around him. He listened to the minute clicks that indicated the apparatus was prepared. He stole glances at Knox to make sure that the next illusion was ready. He steadied Kathy Lewis when her nervousness threatened to reveal herself. Now working as a solo act, you don't have to deal with all these things, but so that having assistants, people helping you, has it's kind of a two-edged sword. They're taking care of things that you don't have to worry about, like when you're done with a trick, they'll take the trick and put it away someplace. You don't got to worry about putting a trick in a certain putting the trick away out of audiences' sights and those kinds of things. But also, you have to hope that they know what they're doing, that they don't make a mistake that causes a trick to go awry. But if that does happen, it helps to use improv to know how to get past a situation unexpected. The audience doesn't know that something went wrong. You try to make it seem like it was supposed to happen that way. The whole idea is the audience has fun and enjoys what's going on. But so even though Kathy Lewis was nervous, he borrowed 3 gold rings from officers in the audience, including one from Brigadier General Cristal. Now, of course, now Jasper is being a really experienced magician. He knows what to expect and how to deal with anything unexpected. When you're first starting off as a magician, things going awry can definitely have more of an impact on you than if you've been performing for a number of years for a number of different audiences. So now, because Knox was really happy, Knox watched from his delight from the wings. The performer was not at all the man he knew so well. On stage, Maskelyne was every bit the West End star. Dressed in his formal clothes, bathed in the spotlight, he seemed so much more imposing than in daily life. He was perfectly handsome and perfectly debonair. His voice was deep and melodious, lulling Frank. Frank had difficulty believing this was the same man who had nervously paced the lighthouse tower at Alexandria Harbor. Again, he was producing this huge illusion at Alexandria to try to fool the Germans into bombing the wrong bay. And the lighthouse, the real lighthouse, because they did a fake lighthouse at the other harbor, they had all the controls there to control the other harbor. And it was important that this had to work correctly, or the Germans would be bombing Alexandria Harbor, and the harbor would be potentially lost as a result of that. So one wasn't just entertaining people. This was life and death. The professor peeked out at the audience from behind the curtain. A few people were fanning themselves. It must have been hot that day, but Maskelyne moved gracefully across the stage. Everyone's eyes moved with him. So we're going through. This is when he's dressed as a Chinese robe. Kathy. There's a pyramid that he stood on top. So Jasper explained to the absolutely silent audience. Otherwise, he shook his head grimly. Then, here's I'm missing something here. The Kathy was in the period. The first act accumulated with a stylized version of the popular illusion invented by his grandfather. That was John Neville Maskelyne. Eye of the Needle. Kathy was sealed inside a miniature pyramid. Its only visible opening a tiny hole at the apex, the top of it, just slightly larger than the circumference of a thin rope. This allows her to breathe, Jasper explained to the absolutely silent audience. Otherwise, he took his head grimly. Then he climbed on top of the wooden pyramid, apparently struggled to maintain his balance on its sloping sides, but as soon as he heard the miniature click from inside the box, indicating Kathy was ready, he steadied himself and nodded to assistants Hill and Graham. They raised an oriental foulard over the pyramid and seconds later lowered it. Kathy was standing on top of the box, arms outstretched in triumph. When the door was opened, Jasper was snuggled inside, incongruously dressed in his flowing Chinese robe. Frank lowered the curtains on Mimic. Tony Francis opened the second half of the variety with an invitation of a Nazi fighter being shot out of the sky by battleship gunners. So they have other people doing entertaining here. So this is basically the show. I'm going to skip ahead here. Everyone departed properly mystified. They gathered in groups as they excited, remembering the illusions that most pleased them and attempting to figure out how they had been accomplished, of course. Ways to find that funny sometimes when people think they know how I did a magic trick and their idea of how it was done was not how it was really done. So, but sometimes I take that as a positive criticism, that maybe I need to do the trick a little bit differently so that they don't think it was done this particular way, even though it really wasn't anyway. That kind of thing. So, But that's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to try to guess how a magician does a trick, even if your idea of how it was done wasn't even right. So Jasper relaxed in his small dressing room. In a few hours, he would put on his uniform and go back to his military work. But this was a time to be savored. It had been a good show, considering that none of his assistants had ever before set foot on a magic stage. It had been a remarkably good show. Everything could have gone very, very wrong. You get inexperienced people out there helping you out. A little bit risky. There were some rough edges that could easily be smoothed over, but he knew his performance had been appreciated and was aware the show would be the main talk of Cairo the following day, and things could be smoothed over. Like, I've been putting on some videos here of different magic tricks that I've been doing, and performing in front of a camera is way different than performing for people. For the camera actually catches things that in a live performance people wouldn't normally catch, and I submitted some videos that I almost want to go back and change because I kind of noticed little things in them that aren't quite perfect. And some of you have been watching it who, if you have a keen eye, you might notice these as well. So I may have to go back and change those. But for now, you go back and watch my videos, see if you can catch some of it. I really tried to make sure that that you couldn't see them, but now that they're posted, I have to go back and completely redo them. Some of them I've actually done over and over again to make sure that you can't catch those things. So kind of a learning process, performing in front of a camera versus a live performance. And I'm sure Jasper, had he been like Doug Henning or Mark Wilson or David Copperfield, magicians that perform in front of a camera, he's done these TV specials, he would recognize those that extra challenge of performing in front of something that's more unforgiving when it comes to noticing things in your act. So several people squeezed into his dressing room to offer congratulations, among them Kathy Lewis and all this. Okay, but reading that part, everybody's congratulating him. Give me a minute here, I'm trying to see here. Alright, Clark stepped forward and said he'd been delighted by the show, then asked if the magician had ever considered adapting his skills to the world of espionage, becoming a spy. Maskelyne had been thinking about precisely that since the day he'd first heard his father's tale of T.E. Lawrence and the magicians a bit, he admitted. This goes back to T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, famous Lawrence of Arabia, and the magicians that were actually used as spies during that period in history. There's not really much difference between what I do and what you do, Clark said cheerfully. I'll bet you put your mind to it. There's all sorts of wonderful contraptions you could develop to help my people. They can use it, Gathering information can be a tricky business. Maskelyne found it interesting that General Clark avoided the word spy. He agreed to consider the offer, and the two men made plans to meet again. Now, later on in the chapter, in the book, I'm going to talk about what he did create. This kind of 007, James Bondish type of thing. I forget the guy's name. Not Q is his name, or I don't remember You've ever seen the James Bond movies? There's this individual who created contraption gadgets for James Bond. So it's kind of intriguing. Cairo, so we're talking about magic show. Cairo loved the magic show. The English language daily newspaper, the Egyptian Gazette, called it one of the most delightful entertainments ever seen in the city. The reception forced him to extend his run. 3 performances a week were scheduled through the end of the summer and sold out as soon as the tickets were on sale, although Maskelyne grumbled about the extra work that would be required. In fact, he was quite pleased at the visibility it gave him. Not only did the publicity open doors at now GHQ, I don't know what GHQ is, for him it enabled him to jump the long waiting lines at Shepherd's. he enjoyed being treated as a celebrity again. So Shepard's some establishment apparently that's hard to get into, long waiting lines. So he's feel like a celebrity again. So that's that. I'm going to jump ahead. Apparently Rommel's on the move again, requiring the Magic Gang to do something else. Early August, Panzer Group Africa had been shifting about the desert. British intelligence plotted the moves, but could not seem to make any sense out of them. Maybe Rommel just trying to confuse our intelligence branch. Knox suggested, aren't we ready for him? Jasper asked. Barkas shrugged. Certainly not as ready as we'll be in 2 months. We gave him a good go, no question about that. But as far as the outcome, his voice drifted into the unknown. 3 men had settled down in the new day room. Let's see. Oh yeah, they had built a new day room. 2 windows still were yet to be installed, and a patch of sky was visible through an uncovered portion of the roof, but otherwise it was finished. Knox brewed up. How much time before he comes at us? Jasper asked. Might as well ask the fortune tellers in the bazaar. Rommel knows we're bulking up, and he must realize we're capable of doing it faster than he is. He might be willing to gamble he's better prepared right now than we are, and come at us. That's why I'm here. We get to prevent him from moving just yet. So, yeah. So they're worried about Rommel coming in and attacking when they're not ready for him. So they need to kind of hold him off for a minute. Maskelyne and Frank asked simultaneously how. They glanced at each other in surprise. I wish I knew, Cunningham, and is open to suggestions. Jasper considered the problem. Assuming we could get anything we needed right now, how would we keep him from moving? Fill in the gaps in the front line, Barkas responded instantly. Thicken it up with tanks and guns and perhaps an infantry battalion of, if you've got a spare one lying around. That's it, then, isn't it? That's our answer. Barkas didn't understand. Certainly it's an answer, but hardly the answer. Needing them isn't having them, is it, though? Jasper smiled smugly. Magic Gang was about to manufacture an army. Mike Hill did not like the job of making bodies. Strikes me as sort of weird, the kind of thing that brings bad luck. Robson patiently explained they weren't bodies, they're just dummies. That's all, like scarecrows or like the fashion dummies in department store windows. So these bodies were the foundation of an entire dummy army. One might argue not much different than a real army. But not very nice though. Actually, soldiers are actually pretty smart. They're not dummies. But dummy army that soon appeared on the desert to help convince Rommel that 8th Army was prepared to fight. The gang had begun turning out dummy soldiers, artillery pieces, and tanks in large quantities. These props were placed among actual concentrations in the field whenever possible. The plan was to secretly replace this canvas and cardboard army with real soldiers as they completed training and with equipment as soon as it arrived. Actually, Maskelyne had been manufacturing men in his workshop for 2 decades. 2 decades, 20 years. Lifelike figures were often substituted for human assistance in difficult sword passes, locked cabinet and levitation illusions with dimming light, black velvet backing, and hidden microphones. These stage dummies easily passed as magicians' assistants, but Jasper was well aware that his audience in the desert would be much less easily deceived. Ordinary cardboard flats had been used in great numbers during the post-Dunkirk panic in England. I haven't seen it, but there's, I guess, a movie called Dunkirk. I don't know if that's in that movie or not, I'm not sure. But they cast distorted shadows and would not serve in the desert. To fool sophisticated Nazi photo interpreters, these artificial or Chinese men had to cast lifelike shadows and even appeared to be moving. Maskelyne decided to make this soldier out of cardboard, canvas, and tubing. Cardboard, canvas, and tubing. It just reminds me of an illusion that I created. You can actually watch it on, if you go to my channel, the one where I'm talking about Galaxy's Edge at Disney World. I do two illusions. I actually have a box where I produce my Porg out of there from the Star Wars movies, and then I have an illusion that I created. I made out of the first one. I made out of cardboard and duct tape, and then I made a second one. This was out of foam and duct tape, and all of the parts were found at Walmart. So, and it lights up as well. I have bought a light. There's like a little battery operated light that's also bought at Walmart. So yeah, you can. So it doesn't take much to create an illusion. Since the dummies were in perpetual misstep, others were in sitting positions, many were running, and a few, dubbed Hills Boys, were lying down with their hands clasped behind their neck as if stealing 40 winks. That's kind of funny. Discarded uniforms were used when available, and the dummies wore the usual wide variety of desert headgear. Townsend, who was becoming an exceptional color camoufleur, that's Hill. Townsend. He was the artist, the painter. Dressed them with paint, cloth, and plaster. Robson added a humorous touch by stuffing the bellies of some of them with balled-up cloth and calling them sergeants. Everything about sergeants having, I remember I was Air Force, and that's pretty typical. There was a sergeant that I knew, the typical sergeant that Robson pictures as a sergeant. And every year we have to run a mile and a half within a certain period of time. I don't remember how long it was. But every year having to do that 1.5 mile run was always a bit of a challenge for this guy. Thinking, well, am I going to be able to make it under the right period of time? So I think they gave you plenty of time to do it. I never had any issues meeting the time, 1.5 mile run. But of course, being young like I was in my 20s, no problem running. But seen at close range, Maskelyne soldiers wouldn't fool anyone. They looked like bundles of costume cloth and cardboard twisted into natural positions, and illusions are that way. You got what they call close-up, where you can look really close to the trick, even examine them, and then others that are for stage only, that in the proper lighting and distance away from the audience, it looks like it was supposed to look like, but if you got close up to it, you'll immediately catch how it works. So, but when these figures were added to dense troop concentrations and observed from thousands of feet in the air, they came alive. Thus, forward platoons became phantom companies and were outlined with the appropriate number of tents, dummy wooden rifles, rows of tin hats that were piled up outside the tents. In many camps, night fires were lit to keep the men warm. The men, quote, although careful attention had to be paid lest they be set on fire. The man on fire. Ah! Imagine the observers up there seeing a man on fire. They'd be like, what? From the very beginning of the project, Jasper intended to make lightweight folding artillery pieces and tanks just as he would make stage tables or prop automobiles by stretching painted canvas over tubular frames. Actually, I have a stage table. Interesting. I don't have it here to show you. but I do have a staged table. It's made out of wood and painted black with a nice picture on the front of it, and it basically just opens up like this. But his stage table is probably a little bit fancier. Prior to this point, cumbersome wooden dummy tanks had been used by Warvell to dupe the Italians. These tanks were made by tacking painted sackcloth over full-size wooden frames. The resulting tanks were so unwieldy, 6 men in a truck were needed to move them. 4 of these dummies could be squeezed onto the bed of a 5-tonner if the truck sides were lowered, often because of the difficulty in moving them. After being used once, these monsters were abandoned to rot in the desert. So imagine coming upon these things in the middle of the desert someplace, wondering, what the heck are these? From a distance beyond 1,000 yards, the wooden dummy might have passed as a real Matilda, and Matilda is what they call their tanks. Except when it got soaked by the cold morning dew, then the damp sackcloth sagged and the tank appeared to be melting. Melting, I'm melting. Ew, the Wicked Witch of the West. Ew. It's a dummy tank, all right. Robson said derisively as the gang inspected one of these hulks, named after the dummy who designed it. He rubbed his hand across the coarse sacking, and bits of paint flaked off. Look at this. Just who the devil did they expect to fool with this bonfire? Jesper pried loose a rotting board from the hull. I'm told it was actually quite effective against the Italians. Robson looked at him dubiously. Come on. It's true, Maskelyne insisted. They were afraid Wavell was going to make them carry it. While Jasper designed a totally new dummy tank, Townsend experimented with tank camouflage patterns, carefully painting in the shadows needed to provide a sense of depth, while Hill supervised the collection of materials from the salvage dump. For the first time, Jack Fuller was given an important assignment. Maskelyne knew that Rommel had mounted his dummy tanks on Volkswagen chassis so that they could scoot about the desert under their own power, and he wanted the gang's tanks to be able to do the same. Imagine have a Volkswagen with a big tank on top of it. That's interesting. Imagine, think if Volkswagen can make something like that. This would be the new Volkswagen. The new 2021 Volkswagen. It looks like a tank. Fuller was detailed to obtain as many motorized chassis as he could through the motor pool, and if he couldn't get enough of them, to make arrangements to buy them on the thriving black market. So I had these chassis to put their tanks on instead of Volkswagens, so they can move their tanks around. Now, this is an unpainted version of it, but we're going to go ahead and show kind of what the tanks look like. They kind of look like that. Now, they don't really look like a tank yet because they don't have the painting on them yet. If you do a web search, maybe you can find the painted versions. The book doesn't show the painted versions. It just shows the unpainted versions. I'm not sure why the writer decided to not put the painted versions in here, but now I probably lost my place. So we're going to go back. Oh, dummy tanks. Let's see. Then totally new dummy tank. All right, there we go. Chassis. Maskelyne dummy tank was simply an elaborate stage prop. He handmade the prototype with Graham, and they carried it out of the workshop in 5 separate pieces. Each part was made of white sailcloth stretched tautly over 3/8-inch rods and 3/4-inch gas piping, and could be folded flat or snapped rigidly into shape. The massive tank hull, the lower tread section, looked like 2 4-foot-high pontoons connected by the wire rods. A rectangular platform, approximately 1 foot tall, was laid on top of these pontoons to serve as the turret foundation. Maskelyne designed this platform so that it would protrude over the sides of the hull and cast accurate shadows. An octagonal 3-foot turret resembling A large hat box with round gun ports scissored onto it was mounted on this foundation, and a smaller round turret topped the dummy. 5 wooden gun barrels, including a 3-incher and a swiveling machine gun, completed their replication. And said it could be hinged together in minutes and carried by 2 men. Now, it's carried by 2 men. Now what? Now the Italian dummy tanks were what again? So unwieldy that 6 men and a truck were needed to move them. 6 men and a truck. Well, Maskelyne's tanks only needed 2 men. We put together in minutes, carried by 2 men, compared to Wevel's wooden dummies that fit 4 to a 5-tonner. 18 of these tanks could be folded and transported in the bed of a standard 3-tonner. So could carry 18 of these versus the 1. So a lot more efficient than the ones used before. Yes, standing unpainted in the middle of the main yard, Maskelyne's white sailcloth dummy looked as if it had been sculptured out of a block of snow, like the one I just showed you. The one I showed you was unpainted. Oh yeah, and he's talking about how he acquired the chassis and stuff from the black market. This is Robson, the one that acquired the black market chassis that would move on their own accord with the tanks on top of it. Hardest part of all was getting them to sign the receipts. Robson winced. I just told them that I couldn't make a government purchase unless I received an authorized receipt, but I'm not sure they understood. Fuller laughed at the memory. I'll be truthful, I don't believe they signed the real names to the slips. The man's having... And then they think he's playing a joke on him. This man's having us on, isn't he? Robson pleaded. Someone tell me he's not serious. Hill shook his head. Sorry, mate. I'm afraid I've got some bad bum news for you. He's got the receipts. The cartoonist clamped both hands over his heart and collapsed onto the floor. Townsend came into the day room just in time to catch Robson's dramatic reaction. What's with him? He asked coolly. Nails cooking again. On occasion, Graham had made breakfast for the gang, especially, usually with distasteful results. Not a good cook, I guess. Skip down. In addition to the motorized chassis, some tanks were mounted on rubber tires and attached to the self-propelled dummies by a thin tow line. Although these mobile dummies could be used only in an area of hard-going or firm ground. Stationary frames could be set up in soft sand for German inspection, then folded up and carried to another location. Now, artillery pieces. Artillery pieces, Maskelyne cardboard. Army, like the tanks, were made of canvas, cardboard, rods, hinges, and painted sailcloths, and could be folded almost flat for easy transport. Their long gun barrels came out of the salvage dump, where Hill had discovered a field of abandoned piping. These pipes, gas pipes, drain pipes, tubing, rubber hose, sections, thin oil lines, even sewage pipes large enough for a grown man to squeeze through, were cut to require size and painted the correct color. Eyeball. Under one jumble of twisted and rusted metal, hosing the gang discovered countless cardboard tubes used once in transports. Bar 4's anti-aircraft ammunition, all nearly piled as if just waiting for the proper suitor to come along and claim them. Hill took one look at these long cylinders and envisioned a glorious fireworks display on Grey Fox Day. Squibs, he shouted, meaning larger bangers or firecrackers, and descended on the pile. Shell casings, Maskelyne corrected officiously. General Cunningham was extremely pleased with the gang's artillery, and the guns were added to the desert batteries as quickly as they could be pasted, stapled, and glued together. But Maskelyne was not satisfied. After observing the guns in position in the field, he decided they had to fire. They can't fire, Frank pointed out. They're made of pasteboard. If canvas tanks could move, Jasper insisted cardboard guns could fire. As long as our real artillery is quiet, he explained, the dummies are just fine. But once the shooting starts, Jerry's going to realize that entire batteries aren't firing. If we could somehow rig them to produce accurate muzzle flashes and smoke trails, Rommel would never be able to tell they're just flimsies, as he calls them. And if you could make a picture of a diamond sparkle, we'll all be rich. Nails Graham tossed in. He's the carpenter, the one that actually puts everything together for wood and such. The guns have got to fire, Jasper repeated, then set to work figuring out how to make that possible. Now we can jump down a little bit here. Neville Maskelyne's great passion was rockets and fire balloons. He combined this love with his knowledge of photography and became the first man to successfully photograph an artillery shell in flight. On the second Sunday of every month, he would go into the Kentish fields to launch a rocket or fire balloon. Labels were attached to each balloon, offering a reward to the person who found it. In this way, fighters were tracked as far away as Germany and Denmark. At about the same time, American scientist Robert Goddard was publishing his landmark paper, A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. Neville Maskelyne was launching rockets 4 feet long and 1.5 feet wide, miles into the sky. So Neville Maskelyne is Jasper's father. So my job was to pack the ground firmly in the base of the rocket. This was for his father. Jasper told the gang. Normally it would rise straight into the morning sky with a furious roar and fiery tail, and then curve gracefully back to Earth. He walked in bleary-eyed and poured himself a cup, as Maskelyne finished his story. One time, though, I must not have done my job too well, because instead of rising, the rocket whirled madly in its pit, then tore loose, and instead of going up, sailed like a burning comet a few feet off the ground. It finally slammed into the door of a small cottage and stuck there like a giant flaming arrow. The cottager heard this tremendous thump and opened his door. He reeled backwards, screaming to his wife, "Run, Lave, the devil's called," and fainted dead away. Hill stood behind Knox, sipping his coffee. When the friendly laughter had died, he asked, "Is our magician telling stories again?" Frank glanced over his shoulder. Well, look who's here. Nice of you to join us this morning, Private Hill. I trust you had a pleasant evening. Hill answered with a salacious wink. Well, then, I'm surprised you're back so early. If I was your age, you would have been here since last night. Hill finished. Meanwhile, leaning over to lift a sausage from Frank's plate with his fingers, Hey, wait a sec, Nails interrupted. I'd like to know what the connection is between Jay's father's rockets and our guns. Maskelyne explained. The rockets blasted off in a great explosion of smoke and flame. The higher we wanted them to fly, the more fuel we'd put in the tank. The more fuel in the tank, the greater the blast-off would be. All we got to do is mix a batch of rocket fuel, and we've got our artillery burst. We'll have to do some experimenting, but we should be able to duplicate any type of cannon flash. After testing various mixtures, Jasper finally decided to load the dummy shells for his cardboard guns with aluminum powder, which produced the flash, black gunpowder for smoke, and iron filings to add the necessary red tint to the flash. The cardboard packaging tubes, originally used to transport real before shells, were used as casings for his dummy ammunition. This kind of reminds me of a show that I did at a nursing home once, where I would open my show with basically a flash of powder. I actually made myself my own flash device. Basically, I just took a tuna fish can, painted it black, and I used Estes rocket igniters used to launch model rocketry. Had that hooked up with the igniter, and then I just went over to this muzzle loading store. They sell muzzle loader guns that you can make or buy there, and they sell black powder of different I don't know how to put it, different I don't say types, but different the way the kernels are. Some are thicker and thinner than others. The different the powder has different. You have like powder that's kind of like sandy. Some's more be kind of like really coarse or fine. Black powder. I can't remember which type that I got, but just put a little black powder in there. Then I would set it off, and it'd be a puff of smoke. But what happened one time when I did the show, a puff of smoke went off, and it set off the fire alarms. So that was a bit embarrassing right there. So sometimes you come up with these brilliant ideas, and they don't kind of work the way you expect. So guaranteed the charges would be evenly loaded. The wife would do it with spoons, Fairleigh said, and was ignored. Fuller kept talking to his wife using spoons, and they kept using every other thing. They kind of ignored Fuller and his spoon idea. Eventually they came around and decided, oh, I guess Fuller's spoon idea was probably a good idea. So after Robinson's counterbalance scale fell apart, the engineers tried the Mrs. Fuller method and discovered it was simple and reliable. And that's the way the shells were loaded. That's pretty funny. It's like, sometimes people have a good idea when it doesn't sound like one. A dummy Beaufort shell consists of 4 desert spoons and aluminum powder, 2 teaspoons, and then this is the formula. This is a formula in case you want to do this at home. 2 teaspoons of black powder and a pinch of iron filings. A 25-pounder required 6 desert spoons of aluminum and powder, 3 mess kit spoons of black powder, and again, a pinch of iron filings. And men loading the cardboard charges wore gloves and aprons to keep the burning powder out of their desert sores and insect bites. They got sores and insect bites. Oh, okay. Sounds like fun. And goggles to keep specks out of their eyes. Naturally, the Magic Valley hut in which they worked became known as the kitchen, while they were cooks and the specifications of their recipes. At dusk one night in the late August, the demonstration was held on a field at one of General Ochlick's new desert training sites. 2 cardboard guns had been placed at random, and a battery of 6 real artillery pieces lengths of metal pipe had been buried in the sand directly below the wooden barrels of the dummy guns and loaded with Magic Gang dummy ammunition. Jasper stood with the invited officers about 2,000 yards from the firing line, trying to look as inconspicuous among them as his folding guns looked. Among real 5-inchers and howitzers at 7:30, a spotter aircraft circled overhead, and the battery fired its first salvo. 8 balls of flame ripped into the twilight, and coils of smoke twisted lazily from each barrel as the crew rapidly reloaded. Carre had been taken to make sure the location of the dummy tank guns was not given away during reloading. Maskelyne silently mouthed his magic words, "Hey, presto!" just as the second volley exploded. The illusion was so complete, none of the assembled officers even attempted to pick out the cardboard guns. The third round had the brass agreeing that the dummies could not be detected in the field. "They're absolutely amazing," gushed an armored colonel. "Why, except for the fact that they don't do anything. Your guns are just as good as the real guns. Jesper was quite relieved. Hill was not there to make the same comment about ranking officers. I guess ranking officers don't do anything, apparently, according to Hill. After the demonstration, the effusive colonel took him aside and reminded him that something would have to be done about flash burns. You can't fire the big guns without scorching the earth in front of them, you know, right? He said, but black cloth could be laid in front of the dummies to simulate scorched earth, Maskelyne replied. When the guns were folded up, the pieces of cloth would be picked up and all traces of the battery would disappear, just as if someone had waved them away with a magic wand. The folding guns and the dummy ammunition were put into production and quickly joined the men and tanks of the Magic Gang army. Filling the gaps in the front line, although Panzer Group Africa continued shifting about, no offensive in force was attempted. So, Rommel did not come in and attack the British army. So apparently this ruse did work. Major Barkas was elated by Maskelyne's bogus army, and he frequently stopped by Magic Valley to watch the cloth men, canvas tanks, and cardboard guns be carted off to the front. It's amazing, Maskelyne, he said one day. It takes you 2 years to get into the army, and less than a year later, you're making your own. So, okay, going to chapter 7. And this is Maskelyne and a fly. He's having a little human shootout with a fly here. Matt was stalking a beefy fly in his office one morning a few weeks later, armed only with a bloodied swatter. When Major Barkas knocked politely on the door jamb, the long-promised office doors had not yet arrived. So his magic factory is not quite complete. Jasper ended his hunt with a powerful but ineffective slap and watched unhappily as the desert fly disappeared into the whirling blades of the overhead fan. What do you think? He asked in greeting. More flies or sand in the desert? Sand, Barkas said emphatically. The real question is, are there more dotty officers out there than flies? Well now, Jasper teased as he hung up his weapon. Aren't you the chipper one this morning? The Major settled into the easy chair. On your behalf, he pointed out, it seems you're finally succeeded in convincing Great Pillars you're some kind of Merlin. Oh? They'd like you to have a go at hiding the Suez Canal. Maskelyne assumed Barkas was kidding. Hide it? Is that all? I was hoping for something more difficult. Hide it, disguise it, turn it into a dance palace for all they care. But they want something done to protect it from German bombers. It's absurd, of course. It can't be done. He paused, then grinned mischievously. Maskelyne had already proved he could accomplish the seemingly impossible. Can it? The Suez Canal was the most important link in the British supply chain. It connected the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, cutting the maritime distance between London and far eastern ports almost in half. As Barkas pointed out, using a series of topographical maps to illustrate the problem, its size made it extremely vulnerable. The canal was 107 miles long, but less than 70 yards wide. So it was 107 miles long. It's pretty long. It's about 70 miles from here to Denver. I'm here in Colorado Springs, and Denver's 70 miles north from where I live. It takes over an hour or so to get there. If you drive at 70 miles an hour, in theory, you can get there in exactly an hour. Drive faster, but less than 70 yards wide, so it's pretty narrow, but very long, and only 42 feet deep at most points. If the Germans were able to close it or even block it temporarily by sinking a single ship, British convoys would be forced to make the longer, hazardous voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, and every Commonwealth army would suffer. Now, as we all know, the Suez Canal was created for that very reason, where naval ships traveling from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean from Europe. They wanted to make it to the we're talking about Africa. Am I losing my perspective here? I think I'm thinking of America. We have the Suez Canal goes through Africa. So yeah, you got Africa. The Cape of Good Horn is at the bottom of Africa. So if you want to travel from one side of Africa to the other, you'd have to go all the way down south, past that's called the Cape of Good Horn. Cape of Good Horn. And you go all the way around the other side. But since they cut a shortcut all the way through the Suez Canal, you can make it there a lot faster that way. To save time. So they ended up visiting the Suez Canal. Jasper and Frank Knox flew to the Suez Canal to inspect the canal defense system, which was nothing more than a thin line of anti-aircraft batteries placed at the most vulnerable points. Looking down on the majestic waterway from one of these raised gun positions, Maskelyne was taken by its simple beauty. It's really quite lovely, he said admiringly. You know, Frank, the first canal was built in this area almost 20,000 years ago. It was blessed by Egypt's high priests. If you close your eyes and let your imagination go, and Knox was not impressed by his history lesson. He thought the request was ridiculous and suggested that the gang could better spend its time on more practical assignments. Do you know how an African elephant hides from the enemies? He responded. Maskelyne did not. It doesn't. It's too bloody big. And that's what you've got here, Jay. A big bloody elephant. Now, of course, Houdini made an elephant disappear. I'm sure this Jasmine was probably thinking this too. Like, yeah, but you can make an elephant disappear, you know. So maybe we can do the same thing to the Suez Canal. After finishing the inspection, they sat in a Suez Canal cafe drinking warm stellar beer. It seemed as if years had passed rather than months since their indecorous landing there in the midst of Wavell's retreat, and the clamoring, overcrowded city had settled back into its normal chaos. Yeah, they're kind of bantering about what they could do with the Suez Canal. Yeah, again, Jasper, Knox still doesn't think there's any way they could deter the Germans from blocking the Suez Canal. Blasted thing is over 100 miles long. Just one small mine planted anywhere, and all your efforts would be wasted. He set his mug down thoughtfully. Look here, I don't like being the voice of doom, but there are some projects we simply will not be able to do. Just because some Tom Nobody colonel wants us to make a camel fly doesn't mean we can do it. We have to realize that Jay, I'm calling him Jay, Jasper, he names him Jay, because it does us no good at all to waste our time running fool's errands. The shouting in the street was getting louder. Now there's some going-ons in the street that I skipped that part of it. So he had to raise his voice to hold Maskelyne's attention. There's no bloody disgrace admitting someone's idea isn't possible. We've come here and looked the place over, and it just isn't possible. Just we're not ready to admit that, but be optimistic, Frank. There is a way to do almost anything. Once you know, I actually did manage to hide an elephant at center stage. Frank looked at him dubiously. No, how'd you manage that? Put a horned helmet on its head and taught it to sing soprano. On the side behind them, two Egyptians in the crowd began hurling terrible curses at each other. One of them, in a rage, knocked the tarbush from the other's head. The second man retaliated by ripping the first man's jalaba, and they started banging away at each other. They locked arms and fell heavily into the street. Meanwhile, the Gari horse, having rested sufficiently, stood up and pulled the carriage away, being careful to step over the street fighters. Maskelyne and Knox were touring the canal. Fortifications work continued at Magic Valley. Rem was nominally in charge during their absence, but had little to do. The factories were busy turning out soldiers, tanks, guns, and ammunition. For the Ghost Army, and construction of the valley was almost complete. The men of the Magic Gang had taken full advantage of this summer lull to explore the Nile Basin, because the enemy concentrated efforts on strategic targets rather than population centers. Cairo was considered a safe city. So you'll skip around. Let's see. Okay. There's a. I'm going to skip all of this over to page 126. Maskelyne had returned to Magic Valley, confident he could make the Suez Canal disappear. There was really no reason it couldn't be done. The same optical principles that applied to stagecraft would work here. It was just a question of providing the proper apparatus. The magician attacked the problem logically. What method might he used to make a large object disappear from the stage? If possible, a trap door. Traps were efficient and easily concealed from the audience, but that would not be possible, not unless the legendary Ali Baba and his 40 thieves showed him the magical means to do so. Second, he might drop a black curtain over the object to be concealed, and that, it's called black art, by the way, where one object is hidden with you got the backdrop looks like the foredrop. So a black curtain over an object, and then there's a black backdrop behind it, so it looks like it's invisible at that point. Yeah, into the black. As you conceal that the curtain would blend into the black background, but as Knox pointed out, there was no curtain large enough to drop over the canal. He considered an arrangement of mirrors. There was a juicy story spreading through the Delta that a Polish officer had the ability to remove his head and cradle in his arms. Jasper recognized this as an old and rarely produced illusion made possible by carefully positioned reflectors. In fact, sections of the canal could be made invisible from the air by mirrors. Kind of interesting, though, that there's like actually another trick I've actually seen someone do. I believe it was Chris Ramsey on his channel, YouTube channel, where he teaches you how to make an illusion like this, only it doesn't use mirrors, where you'd have to have a coat. You're wearing a coat, and then you're holding your head, and you cough. It looks like your head just falls off your shoulders, and you're like holding your head right here. And they kind of use it as a prank to prank people. That get the reactions of people is just priceless. They're like, what? And he actually teaches you how to make this. So, but it's pretty simple to make. Most magic tricks or illusions are simple in principle of how they're made. That's why the idea of wanting to know how a magic trick works, you probably don't really want to know, because you'd be like, oh, is that how it works? Really? It's a little bit disappointing when you learn how it really works. So a lot of magic is about misdirection, and the talent and skill of the performer is what makes the magic work, not so much the equipment itself. Position reflect. In fact, sections of the canal could be made invisible from the air by mirrors, but whether the entire waterway could be hidden that way was doubtful. He worked with the concept for a few days, standing over his sand table. Now again, his sand table, kind of interesting. Instead of a map, he's got this table that has like sand on it to represent the desert that they're in. He uses it as kind of a 3D map. and moving small mirrors around until he became convinced that the number of mirrors needed to accomplish the feat made it impractical, and at least under existing conditions, impossible. But the mirror idea is not totally, it's kind of getting close to how he's going to make this happen. The mirror idea is getting close there. So he decides to go do some other work here. Been working on other small projects for General Dudley Clark to take his mind off of it. Sometimes you try to think too hard on something, the solution is even harder to come up with. So take your mind off the solution, then possibly it'll come to him. But it was his perseverance that finally paid off. With a wave of his magic wand and a puff of smoke and flame, he figured out how to make the Suez Canal disappear. Now, he tested the solution on Frank Knox. Now, Frank Knox was the skeptic, going, "Oh, there's no way you can make how long is it? Over 100 miles long? I forget exactly how long it was, but over 100 miles long, which is that's a lot of distance to try to make disappear. It's a pretty big area to make disappear. So he decided to test the solution on his skeptic, Frank Knox. Seating the professor in the easy chair, rescued from the dump, he stepped behind a table, and began his demonstration. "I was looking for something overly sophisticated," he explained, as he placed 3 black wooden balls and 2 army flashlights on the table, "and that's why I overlooked the obvious solution. Frank, you know why magicians use flame and smoke on stage, right? Part of the show, I assume, to hide whatever they're doing." "Right. Most often those devices are used to obscure a disappearance or an exchange taking place on the stage." And I like to go to Disney World all the time, and there's a show called Fantasmic, and they do an amazing job at the end of the show using smoke, where Mickey Mouse is sitting on top of a kind of a mountain-looking thing, and then he flashes smoke, bam, he's gone. Another flash of smoke at the bottom of the base of the mountain, and Mickey appears. The timing is just impeccable. It's just so obviously the smoke is hiding his disappearance and reappearance again, but very effective way to make someone appear. I say David Copperfield do something similar. He disappeared on stage and then appeared right behind me, but instead of using smoke, he actually used he may have used smoke. Maybe I missed the smoke when I turned around. Smoke, and then he had like these little I don't want to call it like what do you call it? Like little squares, tiny squares of like confetti that just used confetti that also flew up in the air as well to hide his his movement from the stage over to behind us. So no one can resist turning to look at an unexpected burst of flame or a sudden puff of smoke. And while their attention is there, you can be quite certain something else is taking place on another part of the stage. He held up the 3 balls, 2 in his left hand, the third in his right hand. "I am holding 3 small wooden balls," he announced somewhat dramatically. "However, I want only one. Watch carefully, please." With a sudden sweeping movement, Jasper smacked his hands together, and so quickly that Knox almost missed it, dropped 2 of the balls under the table. "Hey, presto," he sang, extending 2 closed fists toward Knox. "Okay, Frank, in which hand are the 2 balls?" Knox was slightly embarrassed at having seen the gimmick. It was not in his nature to unmask anyone. "I'm afraid I got you this time, Jay," he said, almost apologetically. "I saw you drop them under the table." "Of course you did," Maskelyne said triumphantly. "In order to make a simple trick like this work, I need something to divert your attention. And that's what I've been overlooking. I needed some sort of cover." Reaching down into the sack suspended from his belt, he retrieved the 2 balls. "Now I want you to watch carefully, but first, The two flashlights on the table were aimed directly at the professor. Jasper flicked them on, forcing Knox to squint to see one, or to see one, forcing Knox to squint to see. He's like this. Watch carefully now, he cautioned. Knox couldn't see anything at all. The lights burned into his eyes, causing his pupils to contract. He turned his head and tried to look from the corners of his eyes. He shaded his brows. Nothing helped. A wall of bright light separated him from Maskelyne. Hey, presto, Jasper claimed. Then asked Knox in which hand he was holding the balls. You know bloody well I can't see anything, Knox replied in a bit huffily. Remember, these guys are British, so they talk like that. Just turn those lamps off, please. Maskelyne snapped them off. Now tell me, which hand? The room was only barely visible to Knox. Chips of light danced gaily in front of his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. All right, he said, pushing his fingers under his glasses and trying to rub the popping specks out of them. You've obviously made your point. Now, what is it? A full minute passed before he could make out the grin on the magician's face. Jasper was right there when we toured the canal. Jasper picked up one of the flashlights and snapped it on and off. The anti-aircraft lights. Listen, he said, striding gracefully around the table and standing over Knox. If we could get enough searchlights around the canal, we could create a curtain of light. If the lights were bright enough, trying to see through that curtain to pick out the canal would be like trying to see the filament in a lighted bulb. It just couldn't be done. As Frank's eyes gradually readjusted to the normal light, the room and the concept became clear. Can we get enough lights? Jasper laughed. Of course not. We can't get enough of anything, but we can increase the luminosity of those that we've got. Knox twitched the tip of his mustache as he considered the proposal, and would work in daylight. It's pretty bright in here right now, isn't it? And you still couldn't see. The concept was so simple it was difficult for Knox to believe it would work, but Maskelyne's demonstration had been convincing. In theory, at least, a 100-mile-long Suez Canal could be made to disappear in an ocean of light. As mentioned before, some of the greatest tricks out there are the simplest ones. Like, again, one of the videos I did before, I actually do a 2,000-year-old trick, at least 2,000 years old, called the Chinese linking rings. The method is quite simple how it works. It hasn't changed in 2,000 years. But yet, magicians to this day still perform it. Let's see. He talks about his knowledge of light physics, which allowed him to make ghosts materialize and dissolve and behead numerous assistants. It would now make it possible for him to hide the Suez Canal. Tin reflectors properly arranged around the beacon would magnify its projection, but determining the most effective reflector shape and the precise angle at which light would bounce furthest required a great deal of testing. Seemed to be an infinite number of possibilities of different shapes they could use, and over a 2-week period in September, the Magic Gang came close to trying them all. The arrangement that they finally settled upon consisted of 24 fan-shaped reflectors welded to a steel band which fits snugly around the lens. So they possessed some workshop miniatures to experiments where they borrowed Searchlight, Maskelyne's Dazzle Light, as it became known, divided a single searchlight into 24 Individual beams, each capable of covering approximately the same area of sky as the original, and projected each of these beams 9 miles into the heavens. During tests, Jasper frequently flew with the Oster pilots to observe the effect of the dazzle light. Although generally pleased with the result, he realized that the relatively static device could be greatly improved by making the 24 reflectors spin rapidly, thus creating a cartwheel of light whirling through the sky. He worked with an engineer electrician to design a modification. Each tin reflector or flickover was bolted to a rotating metal ring powered by a small gasoline engine. Its rotating speed could easily be regulated. A working model was fashioned and shot a whirling spray of light spokes into the sky at dazzling speeds. Once Jasper was satisfied with the scale model, he scheduled a formal demonstration of the actual device for air defense and air staff. As before, he would fly in an aircraft to view the effect of the dazzle light from the pilot's vantage point, while Knox would be in charge on the ground to determine the practical value of the spray against aircraft capable of flying higher and faster than the Oster. Staff provided an American-built American-built C-47 Dakota and a Speedy Spitfire for the test. Jasper invited Professor M.W. Sawyer of Cairo University, a well-known expert on light physics, to come along on the flight. Now, Spitfire was Britain's fighter jets that used during World War II, one of the classic aircraft, very effective in the air war against Germany. On the night of September 21st, 1941, the two aircraft flew at wingtips 12,000 feet above the North African desert. Maskelyne was in the Dakota with Sawyer, peering down at the ground through light cloud cover. Above them, the heavens sparkled, while far below, a ribbon of small craft showing navigation lights formed a constellation along the twisting path of the Nile. But as the Dakota flew deeper into the desert, the lights of the civilization began to recede. When Cairo was a little more than a gem speckling on the horizon, Maskelyne asked the pilot to signal the searchlight crew to begin the test. Knox received the request and flickered the light on. "Put your goggles on, chaps," he reminded his crew. Huddled near a truck a few yards away, the observers also followed his command. The light illuminated slowly, a speck of light on the black velvet desert. The beam was aimed quite a bit to the left of the aircraft and was at first a dull brown, but as it gained power, the brown grew into orange, then yellow, then a clear river silver, and finally white. Pure white, 24 white spikes of light cutting into the night. A few thin clouds were jabbed and glowing a dull gray. But most of the beam stretched into the heavens beyond the senses. The two pilots adjusted their course and flew toward the lights. Maskelyne pressed against the cabin window and watched with satisfaction as the beams climbed into the sky. On the ground, Frank Knox had everything running smoothly. He checked to see that everyone on the site was wearing dark goggles, and again warned them not to look directly at the swirling beam. "Please remember to keep your eyes down," he directed. When the beams reached full illumination, the spikes began rotating. They moved sluggishly at first, casually floating in an 8-mile wide circle. Gradually, though, like a carnival ride gaining momentum, they picked up speed. They began spinning rapidly, snapping through the sky, whirling. They twisted into a deadly tornado of light, ripping open the sky directly in front of the two planes. Maskelyne tried to watch the spinning beams as they accelerated, but he quickly became dizzy, then nauseated. "Oh, damn," he shouted angrily, realizing what a terrible mistake he had made. Then the Dakota flew into the maelstrom, and the whirling spray turned and the whirled up inside out. The light poured through the windows and ripped into Maskelyne's soul. He tried to squeeze his eyes shut, but the glare sliced through his eyelids. He covered his eyes with his hands, But that didn't help. The lights pried his mind open, overwhelmed his senses, made rational thought impossible. He felt as if his brain were being torn from his skull. The Spitfire went down seconds after the light hit. The Dakota began side-slipping through the sky, desperately trying to escape the strobe light trap. Suddenly its nose glided up smoothly toward eternity. For a moment it balanced playfully on its tail. Then it fell backward and began somersaulting toward destruction. Even then it could not escape the madly whirling beams. Sawyer, the professor of light, was thrown into a steel bulkhead and sliced open his arm. Maskelyne was yanked from his seat and hurled against the fuselage. The flying lights of the planes had briefly been visible as they made their approach, but had disappeared into the dazzle lights. No one on the ground realized what was happening. The Dakota was dying, twisting toward the desert. Its pilot fought for every inch, but the plane was out of control. Maskelyne couldn't stabilize reality. The rolling beams hit the plane again. The ground was suddenly above him, then to his right, then below. He clawed the wireless, knowing it had to be within his grasp. But the world had become nothing except light. It had no feel, no sound, just light. There was no wireless in this world. Nanks yawned. He checked his watch and wondered what they were doing up there. He tried to estimate the speed of the planes against the amplitude of the beacon. Were they out of range? He wasn't sure. It was impossible to hear the drone of the engines above the searchlight's cooling system motor. He finally decided that enough time had passed. No need to risk attracting any stray Jerrys who might be on patrol. Cupping his hands around his mouth, he shouted, "Let's shut it down! Let's shut it down!" The spinning beams slowed. The light began browning out. The Dakota pilot fought. The flashes exploded his eyes and somehow managed to read his altimeter. The plane was 600 feet off the floor and dropping. He reacted instinctively, diving onto the elevators, then began praying his plane up into the safe sky. It continued plummeting for a few seconds more, then paused, its engines complaining. Then it reluctantly began to ascend. Maskelyne breathed. The Spitfire was in an area even more precarious. Let me read this right. The Spitfire was in an even more precarious position when the searchlight was dimmed. It was flying upside down, less than 400 feet off the ground. Its pilot read his altitude correctly, but did not immediately realize he was inverted. It was upside down. So he started climbing down into the desert. He was like this. So he tried thinking he's climbing, he's going towards the ground. At the final moment, for a reason he would never be able to understand, nor explain, one might think, I don't know, intervention from someplace. He knew he was going to die. He punched the stick forward, raising the nose of the inverted plane, and began climbing to safety. Later he would joke that his spit, he called it a spit, his spit had an itchy back, and he was just scratching it on the sand. Both planes landed safely. Maskelyne was stunned and nauseated. His hands wouldn't stop trembling, and his head pounded. But he suffered no serious injury. Professor Sawyer's wounds required some stitch work. Air Staff Command insisted the passengers and both pilots be checked into No. 8 General Hospital for complete examination of observation. Jasper protested mildly as he felt was proper, but was actually glad for the medical attention. He felt a bit dopey. He was assisted into the van for the short drive to the hospital. He smiled wanly and said to Frank Knox, who had raced to the airfield, "It works quite well, doesn't it?" Yeah, too well, actually. One would think. More than anything else, Knox couldn't help being aware that Maskelyne's always perfectly His combed hair was finally a mess. Long strands of black hair stuck to his sweaty face and resisted his efforts to brush it into place. For some reason that made Frank feel good. He smiled. Yes, Jay, it does seem that way, does it? We had a rough time of it in the air testing out something I'd invented. Jasper wrote to Mary from his hospital bed 2 days later. Perhaps you were right after all about this flying business being dangerous. It seems that these planes are perfectly safe, she wrote back. I don't know what you're doing to them, but I must believe it's your own fault. Please desist instantly. I would like you back home in one piece, please. So, obviously this worked. The whirling spray had proven its value in the deserts. Similar devices were manufactured in England for use on the home front. Maskelyne's magic mirrors eventually became an important weapon in British air raid defense systems. Although the precise number of enemy pilots who became disoriented when hit by the beam and lost control of their aircraft has never been totaled, the spray received credit for assisting in numerous Hinkle and Merchantment kills, as well as preventing countless others from reaching their targets. So Merchantments, Hinkles are of course German aircraft. But the incorporation of the spray into the Canal Defense Force was only the beginning of its service in North Africa. Toward the end of 1941, enemy bombers began making regular attacks on the oil storage tanks holding 8th Army's precious fuel reserves. The Desert Air Force made a valiant effort to fight off the raiders, but had neither the manpower nor the equipment to ensure complete protection. Various camouflage schemes were tried, but none of them seemed likely to fool Rommel's air reconnaissance experts for very long. Now they wanted to have this dazzle system, of course, around the fuel tanks. But Maskelyne pointed out that unlike the ribbon-thin canal, the tanks were concentrated in a relatively small area. Only one lucky bomb dropped through the curtain of light would still be enough to wipe out much of the reserve. The only sure way to protect the tanks, he wrote in a long memo to Selby, was to convince the Germans they had already been destroyed. So basically a variation of the Alexandria Harbor deception was proposed using papier-mâché rubble, painted canvas, drop cloths, and oil fires. It would be relatively simple to make the tanks look as if they had been bombed out of service, but drawing the bombers away from them in the first place would be considerably more complicated. Like the harbor, the tanks had to be moved, but unlike Alex, there was no open area nearby large enough to substitute as a tank farm. It's going to be shadow casting used by the they're going to use the casting of shadows to cause the bombers to miss their target. Among other devices, air photo interpreters and bombardiers use the shadow cast by an object to help determine its size and location. By comparing the lengths of a shadow at a specific time with shadows cast by nearby objects of known size at the same time, all sorts of vital information about the original object could be gleaned. On the desert where there were few fixed objects on which to make such a comparison, small objects could easily pass as larger objects as long as each part was in scale. So working with Knox and Townsend, Jasper redesigned the flickovers. New curved tin reflectors were made to flatten searchlight beams rather than magnify them. These lights were situated behind the tanks and aimed at them instead of into the air, just as a man standing in an open doorway with the sun directly behind him would cast an elongated shadow out of all proportions to his size. The lights dramatically altered the size and shape of the tank shadows, thus giving aerial observers a completely false impression of their location. To test these new flickovers, Maskelyne directed a dummy air raid on the depot. Pilots tried to drop flares as close to the tanks as possible from 3 different altitudes. The nearest flare landed almost a half mile away. So the persistent Luftwaffe attacked the depot for several months. They tried various methods to break through the light camouflage, including dropping flares of their own to eliminate misleading shadows at the beginning of a raid. Nothing worked. Their bombs fell harmlessly in areas surrounding the depot. After each raid, papier-mâché rubble and painted drop cloths were put in position and smoky oil fires were lit. By the beginning of 1942, the Germans either were convinced they had successfully destroyed the tank farm or could no longer absorb the losses they were taking. Because the attack ceased, the storage tanks were left alone for the remainder of the North American campaign and eventually provided the millions of gallons of fuel that powered the final desert offensive. So when Maskelyne created these lights to essentially hide the Suez Canal, make it invisible to the airplane so they couldn't bomb it, the offshoot of these lights were used in other places, in this case to protect these tanks from being destroyed by the enemy. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Now what does a magician do now after they produce their biggest illusion ever? Well, you go and you start teaching people things. So Jasper Maskelyne was teaching troops about what happens if you're caught as a prisoner of war. So it's like 1 or 2 evenings each week through the fall, normally accompanied by Knox and one other gang member, the Magic Gang members. He would be flown to a training site on a desert lager, a night tank encampment similar to those made by America Old West pioneers, and lecture from the tale of a Fordsham or Bedford lightweight truck. I'm merely here to tell you what you might expect if you become a prisoner of war. He would solemnly begin. Under the agreements of the General Geneva Convention, the only information you are required to give your captors is your name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. However, Jerry is a clever fellow and Jerry meaning the Germans, will try many different methods to trick additional information out of you. If you're wounded, for example, you may well be visited by a darling little old lady who will speak English, who will be very sympathetic, and who will ask you seemingly innocent questions about your hometown. Anything you tell her will go directly to German intelligence and may provide important information for some Luftwaffe bomber pilot attacking your home. Also, you must assume all of your mail would be opened and read. But now these guys have been like working long, hard hours. They're how you sit in a boring lecture. It's kind of like try to keep awake, stay awake, stay awake. So some of them were like falling asleep. So to get their attention, he would actually pull out his magic tricks now as a way to try to present this material to these people here. So an example here was using a bag. Said when you're put in the bag, he yelled, holding high a rucksack and turning it inside out to show that it was empty. The first thing you want to do is begin making plans to escape, or give aid to anyone else who means to escape. Depending on your specific situation, there are any number of methods you might try. For example, he said, reaching into the sack, you might try to fly out of the camp. With that, he withdrew a white dove and released it to fly into the dusk. Or you might try tunneling. Again, he dug into the bag, and this time pulling out a rabbit. So his magic tricks were quite popular here. Watch something that you're required to listen to, but people were actually really liked his presentations, as General Clark had figured Maskelyne's magic reinforced the important aspects of the lecture, pounding home the message in an unforgettable manner. Just Maskelyne's escape and evasion lectures became famous throughout the Middle East and later the Far East, and large crowds of soldiers pushed in to see him work. So, there's some examples of that, but it's kind of funny though that So the other thing he ended up doing is it says right here, he put his family secrets to work and developing escape kits. So first he has a lecture of lecturing these troops using magic tricks as to what to happen if in case they were captured. Now he's making equipment they could carry with them in case they're captured that help them make it back across enemy lines to safety. Unlike the great escape artist Houdini, who among the other skills was able to swallow a key and regulate it when it was and regurgitate it when it was needed, soldiers had to be able to hide their escape tools on their person or inside equipment that would be carefully inspected by the enemy. Faced with that problem, Jasper designed tools that could be hidden in the most obvious places or that didn't have to be hidden at all. The aglets or shoelace tags or a seemingly ordinary commando boot, for example, were actually tiny compass needles, while a map was concealed in the boot tongue and a file and a hacksaw were hidden beneath the side flaps. So things, innocuous things that the enemy wouldn't think to confiscate at all. There's other examples here he gives. So once a man escaped his captors, his chances of making it back to his own lines usually depended on his courage and his compass. A compass was the most essential escape tool, hence the most difficult to obtain. Maskelyne solved the problem in various ways. Most Desert Air Force crewmen carried a miniature compass screwed into the back of a brass uniform button, while foot soldiers wore a battle-dress belt buckle that could be broken down and converted into a compass. Magnetized needles were concealed inside pipe stems and cellular collar stays. Jasper's compass needles became so sophisticated they could pass as bamboo slivers and be carried in a pocket without fear of detection. Yet when they were dropped into a water puddle, they always pointed north and south. The M19, this is what he worked for. M09 is one that had when he was making these for. Eventually put more than 2 million miniature compasses into service, including 91,000 collar stays. The collar stay, where was that? What was that called? I think I skipped that part. I don't see the color stay here, but M19 also put into good service these things. Also for spies, he made like 007, and his friend who made him all these sophisticated devices that he used was in fact a very powerful miniature telescope. What appeared to be a common cigarette holder was in fact a very powerful miniature telescope, focused by sliding the mouthpiece back and forth. His leak-proof fountain pen allowed an agent to write in a bold hand, but also fired a single high-density tear gas shell. His rice paper maps were sprayed with salad oil for protection against rain and sweat, as well as to make them more palatable if they had to be eaten. Invisible inks had long been employed, of course, by stage magicians and phony spiritualists to present messages from the departed, also ways back by the time of the Civil War as well. Some slight chemical alterations, they were used by undercover agents all over the world. So John Neville Maskelyne had publicly exposed many mental telepathists who communicated with their assistants by subtle trick codes. Jasper put his knowledge of their message to work to enable spy masters in Cairo to get messages to their puppets. His simplest device proved to be the most practical before leaving for undercover assignments. He occupied territory. Agents were issued common leather belts approximately 3/4 of an inch wide when headquarters had to send them an important message. A length of store-bought string had to send them an important message. A length of store-bought string would be wrapped lengthwise around a belt of exactly the same 3/4 inch diameter. The message would be plainly written on the string in dark ink. The string would then be unraveled and used to wrap a gift box. The string appeared to be covered with ink spots, but no one ever suspected that These spots formed a message. Inevitably, the package would be searched, but as it contained no contraband, it would be delivered to the agent. Upon receiving it, the agent would wrap the string lengthwise around the 3/4-inch belt and simply read his instructions. So, another thing they wanted Maskelyne to do was perform another magic show. The magic show was for, let's see what I got here. Move it down. But the magic show for Maskelyne worked at MI9 on a part-time basis for almost 3 years, and during that period contributed to the success of one of the most elaborate spy operations of the world. But only once did Clark allow him to work as a spy, an incident that took place just prior to Operation Crusader. Just put on a grand magic show for Clark and almost cost him his life. October 1941 was the most profitable month yet for the spies of Cairo. The magic show was put on, let's see, who was it that did it? Well, there's a radio they're trying to find. They believe that there's this prince. Because there's an attack they wanted to do. Winston Churchill was coming to the desert to personally launch the attack. What was it? Operation Crusader. But there's essentially a German spy. He was a king, and in his palace was a radio set. They didn't want the information to get out as to what the British were doing. They needed to confiscate that radio set. Talking about MI9 creating rumors. Clark's intelligence section actually created a meaning of the rumors just to keep their German counterparts thoroughly confused. The idea is most of the spies in the city were well known to them, and the quality of their work was generally poor. But there was one unknown source that did concern them. A powerful transmitter broadcasting from Cairo had been sending remarkable accurate information to Africa Corps. The transmitter had finally been located, but there was little A-Force could do to silence it. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. Again, they're going to be setting this operation, and they want to make sure they confiscate this before the operations occurs, so that the Rommel's forces don't find out about it. The rub is that it seems to be hidden somewhere in Farrak's palace, and exasperated General Clark told Maskelyne they were sitting in his office, and the hollow music of a wooden finger pipe drilled through the thin floor with the establishment above. We can't take any decisive action till we're positive it's actually there, and the king isn't going to let us go mucking about the palace searching for it. So you see, it's rather a sticky problem. For the past 2 weeks, Maskelyne had been opening Farrak's mail for A-Force, then reconstructing the royal seal after the contents had been copied by intelligence agents. The letter had verified the existence of a large Swiss bank account, but offered no real proof that the young king was cooperating with the enemy. The existence of a transmitter in his palace seemed to remove any doubts. Then is he collaborating? So they were opening this king's mail. Clark frowned. We're not sure exactly yet. Abdin Palace is a large place, and the king is often, he groped for the polite words, otherwise occupied. There's much that goes on inside that he doesn't know Dickens about. So what they want to do is they're going to have a magic show for the king. put on a magic show. And Jasper's wondering, well, why would the king be interested in a magic show? I mean, there was one night when King Fark had shown up unexpectedly at the Empire Theater performance and seemed to thoroughly enjoy the show, but this was something else entirely. What makes you think he'll want a show here or there? His ego, His Majesty would welcome the opportunity to host a command performance. So they're going to put on a magic show as a ruse in order to for the spies to rummage through the house and find this transmitter. So and we're going to skip ahead to what's going on here. Yes, he puts on the magic show. Everybody's like itching to do this. Most of the gang felt the same way, like all soldiers. From the moment each of them arrived in Egypt, they had talked about getting a cushy job in Cairo, something that would allow them to live in safety and work in relative comfort. But as time passed and they worked at their cush jobs at the camouflage section, they began to realize they were living on the periphery of a most important experience. For them, the palace magic show wasn't the answer. It kept them occupied for a while, but as 8th Army roused for the offensive, they felt more and more left out. Well, they get their chance later on in the book. Let's skip ahead to the show. See where are we at here. This is one act that he was doing that allowed Maskelyne to get away for a while and go rummage through the castle and try to find this transmitter. And it's this is kind of a funny thing that happens. He actually enlists the help of the Farak, King Farak. I'm thinking of the prince, King Farak. There's a series of boxes he's going to inspect. By the time the king had taken his bows, the stage was set. Farak was asked to examine every box for trap doors, false sides, or fake locks. He inspected each one, so he had all these. So he's keeping him busy inspecting all of these boxes, and it's kind of a humorous situation that's going on here. Maskelyne quickly was roofed, undressed in engineer shorts and T-top, crossed to the door. This is he was in one of the boxes that had a trap door on there. Upon receiving the 3-knock signal from Maskelyne, Frank Knox opened a trap door in the stage directly below the trunk. Although Farak did not detect it, half of the trunk bottom was on camouflaged hinges and could be opened outward by pressing a spring bolt hidden inside. Once Knox had tapped twice on the bottom of the trunk to indicate that the trap was open, Maskelyne pressed the bolt, sliding out of the trunk, being careful to snap it closed. Behind him, he climbed down a 3-rung ladder to a small, dimly lit space below the stage. Knox fastened the trapdoor after him. You've got a touch over 6 minutes. Right, Maskelyne quickly removed his robe and dressed in engineer shorts and T-top. Crossing the door, Knox could barely resist laughing. So now Maskelyne is playing spy, trying to find this transmitter. But they're playing on the king right here. King couldn't find. He's looking from box to box. So Farak did not find Maskelyne in the leather suitcase. The audience was beginning to titter on the antics of the playful spirits. The king managed to keep a smile on his face. He trailed Kathy back across the stage to the ivory box. So there's an ivory box, another box. So then Maskelyne's looking around. Finally, he did find it though. Finally, Maskelyne found the transmitter in the printing shop. It was hidden behind stacked boxes of paper, and he did not spot it immediately, but he found a wire pushed against the floor molding and traced it. There was nothing extraordinary about the transmitter. A microphone was plugged into it, and a pair of headsets rested on top, and he felt no great sense of relief in locating it. As Clark had requested, he briefly scoured around for a code book, but did not find one, so he had to get back. So Fox found the seventh box empty. He marched rapidly across the stage to the last box. He was not enjoying his role and wanted it to end, so it's pretty funny. So King Fox opened the eighth box, expecting to find the magician hunched and chained inside. It was empty. And then his assistant, she kept her cool magnificently, making everything seem like this is how it's supposed to be. The audience accepted this as part of the illusion, but Fark did not. His face was taut just as he opened his mouth and shout orders to the palace guard. A muffled cry came from inside one of the previously expected boxes. "Hey!" Maskelyne was yelling. "Help me out of here! Help me out! Help me out!" The audience roared. Fark, unsure, opened the box again. The magician was curled up inside, handcuffed. So he ended up fooling this king right here. And Kathy Lewis, of course, his assistant. During the king's banquet following the performance, Jasper reported his discovery to Dudley Clark. Soon thereafter, the general made polite excuses and departed. So then, the following morning, the GHQ took action on Maskelyne's discovery. At dawn, Abdon Palace was surrounded by Commonwealth troops. In combat gear, the portly British ambassador, Sir Miles Lampston, marched to the main gate and demanded an audience with the palace chief of staff. So they confiscated the radio equipment that was there. So now they're ready to launch their attack now. But the Magic Gang, they were going to feel left out. So then Maskelyne had to go talk to some people, and was able to get the Magic Gang involved in this operation that's going to be underway here. Magic Gang was ordered to alert status on November 14th. They trucked to the rim of the desert to join the gathering army. 24th Armored was already in position when they arrived, equipped with 35 Magic Valley folding tanks, 24 dummy field guns, and a sufficient dummy ammunition, and 12 Bedford trucks. It's assigned strength with 42 men, all Royal Engineer volunteers, plus Maskelyne's group. 24th Armored's only real weapons were some infantry rifles and officer sidearms, which, according to the complaining Private Hill, might prove handy if we get attacked by a squad of ducks. The unit's mission was to proceed south along a carefully mapped desert route until observed or engaged by enemy forces. Then, when engaged, withdraw rapidly because they actually can't fight. So, now this operation actually was quite successful, and basically Rommel was pushed back to where he started from. Much more about their army. Great Pillars finally had an old-fashioned war to fight until Crusader. The war in the desert had been an irksome series of titanic battles followed by long periods of reinforcement and resupply. Top Brass had a difficult time fighting the pulse of the campaign. Nigeria was standing tough and appeared ready to fight to a conclusion. Here, at last, was a battle with which an officer conservative in history would be comfortable. Residents of Cairo got used to the idea of the Crusader would continue for a while, began weaving it into their daily lives. It became habit to listen to the overnight war news each morning, going to the office and to pause regularly. Yeah, so this point, the Magic Gangs pretty much feels like their days are over with. Um, their essentials have helped hide the existence of a massive armored forces from Rommel's observation, allowing 8th Army to achieve total surprise, while decoy artillery pieces and soldiers had swelled British lines. Somehow, though, none of this made the men of Maskelyne's Magic Gang feel any more a part of the action. Next would be the most difficult Maskelyne spent in the desert. In his own mind, he had achieved his original goal. He had proved that the techniques of stage magic could be adapted to the warfield, but he felt he had really accomplished nothing. He had failed in his desperate efforts to step out of the family shadows. Rather than making his own name important, he felt doomed to be remembered as a bizarre footnote to history, a magician playing at war. In the end, only the guns made a difference. Now, there's some interesting news that pops up here that made get everybody all excited. Now, this was the artist Townsend saying the artist did not take the brew. What are you talking about? Knox spotted him standing alone and brought a mug of stout to him. The artist didn't take the brew. Yanks are in, he said in a stunned voice. What? Frank shouted. It was impossible to hear him over the noise. In precisely the same soft tone, Townsend repeated, Yanks are in. Who's what? America. Townsend said a bit louder but evenly. They're in the war. A group standing nearby overheard him and immediately gave him their full attention. What's that? One of them asked. The Japs bombed the American fleet in the Philippines this morning. They're going to invade. Roosevelt's making it official tomorrow, but they're in. The news jolted the rooms like a Joe Louis punch. So the entrance of America into the war, again, seemed to cement the idea that the Magic Gang's days are over. But for Maskelyne and the Magic Gang, the battle, perhaps the war, was over. Like supply clerks and WAFs and overage officers, they were forced to follow the battle in newspapers and on the radio. So they thought. But as events soon proved, Professor Knox is wrong. The Magic Gang show was about to begin a long encore. In November, German submarines had sunk the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. So now they wanted to make a submarine. And make a submarine out of, and they made tanks, they made men, they made all kinds of fake artillery. Now the Navy wants them to make a submarine, and they made. In order to do so, they found an old I think here we can find it here. Trans-Arabian Railway. There's a whole bloody yard of rusting sleeping cars. Sleeping cars like a train. So they use the sleeping cars, these these old set of sleeping cars. Seems they were built for the Trans-Arabian Railway, and by the time they got here, Lawrence Arabia had blown the railway to bits. They're of absolutely no use at all to anyone but us. There are 18 sleeping cars in all. As Fuller said, they had been ordered from England at the turn of the century. So now they're still in business, building a fake submarine, and they needed to build a big fake submarine because, as a ruse, because the Royal Navy had controlled the Mediterranean, attacking the Germans and Italian convoys with impunity, depriving Rome of desperately needed supplies. Suddenly, the situation was reversed. The battered British fleet was no longer capable of maintaining its stranglehold or providing security for convoys. Desperately needing supplies for Panzer Group, after began getting through to Libya, the Luftwaffe renewed its attacks on Malta, Britain's most important naval base in the Mediterranean and Keystone. They needed a new navy. The Magic Gang was back in business, so they create their fake navy with their submarine made out of a sleeping car. So that which concludes my reading of The War Magician. Hope you enjoyed that.